Hi, it's Terry Rowe from Hotspotting, bringing you my regular weekly feature at this time of the week, the war on misinformation. And today I want to talk about what's happening with prices across the Melbourne metropolitan area. The key feature for us, having done a recent suburb-by-suburb analysis of the Melbourne metropolitan area, is the strength of prices in many areas across Melbourne. That may surprise some people because media keeps telling us that Melbourne prices have dropped 8 or 9% in the last 12 months in annual terms, and implying that values are falling right across the city. But that's far from the truth. Our suburb-by-suburb survey has actually found there are more suburbs with prices rising, including many with strong price rises, than there are suburbs with major decline. In fact, we've identified 81 suburbs in the Melbourne metropolitan area where median prices have increased by more than 10% in the past year using CoreLogic data. And it highlights the reality that figures published by the media on prices in our major markets mislead more than they inform. And they usually tell us nothing that's useful about property market because they generalise. They produce a single figure to describe an entire really major city. That's actually quite an ambitious and frivolous undertaking because it usually ends up with a figure that's meaningless. It doesn't tell us about the diversity within a market and the size of Melbourne, given that Melbourne has over 500 suburbs in the metropolitan area, and they're as diverse as, say, Toorak versus Melton in the far west, or trendy Richmond versus working class Epping up in the far north. And it's very hard to throw all those areas with the diverse transactions, the many thousands of transactions that take place in all those diverse locations, and to throw them all into a single melting pot and come up with one figure that describes what's happening to that market. Because what we've found with our suburb-by-suburb research, there is enormous diversity in terms of price performance across Melbourne right now. Now, in terms of the various research entities that produce a single figure to describe what's happening with a major market like Melbourne, we have CoreLogic telling us that in the last 12 months, Melbourne house prices on average are down about 9%, Domains is about 8%, but then we have three other really major sources, so it's only about 2%. Now, they include the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who deserve to be listened to, the nation's largest real estate website, realestate.com.au. They say that the decline is about 2% in Melbourne, and also SCM Research has a similar figure. So there's three major sources. So the drop in Melbourne prices are about 2%, as opposed to some of those earlier sources I mentioned saying 8 or 9%. And then we've got the Real Estate Institute of Victoria recently published some data saying that last year the average price across Melbourne actually rose 1.4%. So we've got a range from a rise of 1.4% to a decline of 9% across 6 different sources, all with different numbers. So what do you make of all that? I tend to think that the three major sources that come up with a decline of about 2% is probably closest to the mark based on our suburb-by-suburb analysis using CoreLogic data. Which is one of the sources that came up with the higher decline figure, 9% according to CoreLogic. But can find no evidence in our suburb-by-suburb analysis to support that figure, because if that was accurate, then we would expect to find maybe 200 suburbs in Melbourne with annual price decline of 8% or more to come up with a city average around 8 or 9% decline. But there certainly is nothing of the case. We could only find 31 suburbs with annual decline in the median prices of 5% or more. But there are 142 suburbs with annual growth of 5% or more, of which 77, in addition to the 142 where prices had risen 5% or more, there were another 77 where the median price growth was somewhere between 1% and 5%. So we've got over 200 suburbs where prices have grown in the last 12 months. Now, of the 142 with over 5% growth or more, 81 of them recorded double-digit growth, in other words, 10% or more. And 93 of the 142 suburbs with substantial growth also recorded growth in the most recent quarter, not just in the last 12 months, which means prices are still rising in those areas. And there was another 25 suburbs that had no change in the latest quarter, which suggests prices are not falling in those suburbs. So more suburbs with growth than suburbs with major decline, which makes us a little bit suspicious of those figures that say Melbourne overall has dropped 8 or 9%. We think the three sources that say it's down about 2% is probably closer to the mark. Now, of the 31 that have had big price drops, according to our suburb-by-suburb analysis, they're all million-dollar median suburbs. They're all at the top end. And some of them have dropped a lot. And we think that maybe they're dragging down the overall position for Melbourne because the big price suburbs have had the major decrease, and that's dragging down the city average. Perhaps that's an explanation. For example, Toorak, which is the most expensive suburb in Melbourne, its median price, according to CoreLogic, has dropped 32% in the last 12 months. Still 3.5 million, but it's a lot lower than it was. St Kilda, another suburb, where its median price has dropped 32%, and its median price is now down below 1 million, whereas previously it was above. The Caulfield suburbs, Caulfield is down 11%, Caulfield East 10%, Caulfield North 20%. Brighton's median price is down 14%, Canterbury's down 9%, Hawthorn's down 19%, Armidale 18%, and other suburbs with million-dollar medians, which have had double-digit annual decreases in their median prices, include Box Hill, Clayton, Fitzroy, Flemington, Parkville, and South Melbourne. But they are relatively few in number compared to the size of Melbourne. Only 31 suburbs that we could find with those big price drops. The short summary of what we found is that the top end has fallen a lot, not all of it, but most of it. The middle market's held firm or has dropped a little in terms of pricing, and then the cheaper end of the market, which is mostly the outer ring suburbs, are still rising, and some of them are rising strongly. So we've got three very different scenarios playing at the top end, definitely falling, middle market holding firm, generally speaking, and then the outer ring areas, the cheaper areas, still rising strongly, many of them. Now, of those 142 suburbs I mentioned where median prices have grown by 5% or more, some of them by more than 10%, 88 of the 142 have median house prices below 700,000, so it's at the lower end of the market. And local government areas where there is many suburbs with strong price growth in the last 12 months, they include Brimbank, Hume up in the north, Whittlesea also up in the north, Casey down in the far southeast, Melton in the far west, Frankston also down in the far southeast, and Wyndham in the far southwest heading towards Geelong. The Mornington Peninsula also features prominently with lots of suburbs which have had strong price growth in the last 12 months. So it's mostly those outer ring areas of the Melbourne metropolitan area that are still delivering the good price growth, which is what you would expect at the tail end of the cycle. There's no doubt that Melbourne overall has passed its peak, but the areas that are still showing growth are the outer ring areas. The boom tends to start in the middle and ripple out. So when we get to the point where the big growth is happening in the outer ring areas, we know that the cycle is almost over. That's undoubtedly the case in Melbourne. But what we're not being told with the generalised reporting about Melbourne prices is that there's still areas where prices are rising strongly. Now, those with annual price growth above 20% in the last 12 months, they include suburbs like Bitton on the Mornington Peninsula, Campbellfield in the Hume local government area up in the north, Clyde North in Casey down in the far southeast, Crib Point also in Casey local government area, Dallas, which is a suburb up in the north in the Hume local government area, Whittlesea in the local government area of the same name in the north, and there's also the suburb of Kyla, which is a bit more expensive than those others I mentioned in the Brimbank local government area, which is in the western suburbs of Melbourne. Now, probably the area with the most prolific price growth in the last 12 months is the cheapest part of Melbourne. That's the Melton local government area in the far west. So we've got suburbs All these suburbs have got median prices somewhere in the 400,000s. Brookfield, Melton North, Harkness, Kurunjang and Melton West. Now, they've all recorded annual growth in their prices above 20% in the last 12 months and still rising. And they are the cheapest suburbs to be found anywhere in the Melbourne metropolitan area. So the pattern is that most of the locations with the big price growth are at the cheaper end of the market, just as most of the locations with the big price drops are at the top end of the market. So that's the general situation in Melbourne at the moment, but it does illustrate how misleading it is to try and encapsulate prices in a major city in a single figure, saying Melbourne property prices have fallen X, because you've got all these different scenarios happening across the Melbourne metropolitan area, and we're generally not being told about it by our lazy and generally incompetent media when it comes to reporting this very important housing market. And we have a situation where we've got 6 different sources all coming up with 6 contrasting figures about what's happening with Melbourne prices overall. One saying a slight rise, 3 saying down about 2%, 1 saying down 8%, 1 saying down 9%. Who do you believe? Who's right? Well, I think it's all dodgy data to a certain degree, and it's only when you do what we just did, a suburb by suburb analysis, every suburb in the Melbourne metropolitan area, that you find what's really going on. Still some pretty strong price growth out there in the Melbourne market, if you know where to find it, mostly in the cheaper outer ring areas. Okay, that's it for now. Terry Ryder signing off on the war on misinformation. Let's do it again, same time next week. Thanks for listening.